Welcome, my friends, to the Quay Radio Hour, your home for free and critical thinking. And I'm your host, Mike Williams. Tonight, my very special guest is Neil Sanders. Neil is considered an expert on the subject of mind control and has been studying the history of this dark art and its application by military and government intelligence agencies across the globe for many years. He holds an M.A. in film studies, studied psychology and media production for his B.A. honors, and is a qualified hypnotherapist. Neil has appeared on several television shows and made numerous radio appearances in Europe and the U.S., and is the author of the book, Your Thoughts Are Not Your Own, Volumes 1 and 2. My discussion with Neil was a fascinating ride down into the mind control rabbit hole, which includes Tavistock Institutes' involvement in the 1960s music scene. And to kick our conversation off, I asked Neil how he got into his research, and here is what he had to say.
Basically, I got into it through the film The Manchurian Candidate, and somebody made me watch it. And I didn't really want to be quite honest, but I'd already knew a little bit about sort of the fact that Frank Sinatra was connected to the mafia. And then after, obviously, the film is the 60s version. And then I discovered that Sinatra, or allegedly Sinatra, had it taken off the market, and then it only came back on the market in 1983 due to his friendship with the Kennedys. And then obviously you discover that the Kennedys were both killed and in suspicious circumstances, shall we say. And there's obviously elements of mind control that tend to go through those. Obviously Lee Harvey Oswald seemed to be completely different people, pro-Castro, 1 minute pro-government. And obviously that could be the sort of many layers of espionage, but it raises certain questions. And then Sirhan is obviously the major sort of, even his lawyer said in open court that he believes Sirhan to be a Manchurian Candidate. And then you sort of look into that and you find out that his lawyer, Larry Teeter, had to sort of petition to get the area where Kennedy was shot to be actually considered with any degree of normalcy in as far as crime scene investigation, and a lot of the evidence was lost. And then you discover that John Frankenheimer was actually having dinner with Robert Kennedy at the house of Roman Polanski on the night before he was taken to the Ambassador Hotel, which is where Sirhan, who swears to this day he can't remember it, and thinks that after talking to a woman in a polka dot dress and drinking far too many Tom Collinses that he was at a shooting range.
Right.
And then, other tangential connections sort of tend to tie into this. Angela Lansbury, obviously, is the other star of the film. You discover that at least one of her kids was friends with the Manson family. The Manson family who were involved in the murders at the Tate Polanski residence. And also who was killed there was Jay Sebring. Jay Sebring was the person that sort of fashioned the toupee onto the head of Sinatra, and also styled basically the entire hippie movement, including famously Jim Morrison. He was also killed there, and it transpires that he was into selling drugs for the mafia, and so there's that element as well. Another person that was hanging out with the Manson family was Dina Martin, who was Dean Martin's daughter, and she introduced Nancy Pittman to the group. And Nancy Pittman, or Brenda McCann as she's sometimes called, one of her aliases, was one of the sort of more hardcore members, supposedly. And so there's a lot of these weird tangential connections. And what sort of seemed to strike me a lot was that it was the mafia and celebrity and drugs, and then this new thing that I was introduced to called mind control and false flags. So basically, having researching, got a bit bored, I went for the more exotic sort of angle. But it was quite serendipitous, because I was doing psychology at university, and also there was like courses in practical media, and not just sort of the making of it, but the construction of media, and the use of colors and the use of framing and the use of psychology. And you notice that a lot of these sort of Freudian terminology and mechanisms, so to speak, they tend to sort of bleed into the disciplines. And so, serendipitously, all these sort of things came together, and I thought, hang on, this is actually plausible in a scientific sense, and I can see how they employ mind control, so to speak, in the media, just to sort of in something as simple as basically, all of a sudden I'm a bad guy, all of a sudden I'm a good guy, because of the angle of the camera and such like that. It's very, very simple framing devices that can be used to manipulate your senses without you knowing, basically.
It's amazing, because you mentioned these names, Angela Lansbury, Dean Martin's daughter. It is very interesting how they somehow converge at some point. Somebody can call it all coincidence, but at some point you got to say to yourself, well, is it really coincidence?
Well, somebody said that to me the other day and says, well, surely this is just the sort of incestuous type of Hollywood crowd. All you said is that this Hollywood person knew this Hollywood person who knew this Hollywood person who knew this Hollywood person. You're absolutely right. But then you throw into the mix the intelligence agencies and drugs and the mafia, and then they find the fact that all of these sort of things tend to also sort of overlap in various degrees, and the huge similarities to real government projects. And then when you start to look at MK Ultra and you go, hang on, they can do this and they can do this and they can do this according to the declassified documents, then you start to think, well, how much of this is orchestrated as well? Because basically, every event ultimately becomes a media event. And so it's strange how these things are presented to the public with a narrative, possibly, and most people might say, well, that's because that's what happened. But this is not always the case. As we've seen in recent events, there's a predisposed narrative. And if there's a predisposed narrative, how was that able to be constructed on the hop? Does that mean that perhaps the entire thing, the entire incident, the hippie movement, serial killers, the Manson killings, 7/7, 9/11, whatever, the event is the event too also orchestrated, manufactured and presented in such a way that is favourable to certain people when it's sort of into the media, so to speak.
Some people might ask as they're listening, well, what is not orchestrated then? Because, we're talking about the movies, we're talking about television, we're talking about the false flags, as you mentioned. If you really get into this, you start to ask yourself, okay, well, let's get the short list. What is not orchestrated?
Well, I mean, if the organisations that have written about this are doing their job, nothing. Because one of the key principles is the manufacture of consent. And what that basically means is the setting of societal norms, defining roles and defining what people will put up with because it is expected. And this is, it came from two people, which is Edward Bernays and Walter Lippmann. And Walter Lippmann, just to take his idea a step further, how are we going to engineer this consent, the engineering of consent, that's the other thing, is to basically paint the pictures inside people's heads, because, as he explains, most people get their understanding through informed wisdom or secondhand knowledge or research, so to speak. But if every single textbook tells you one thing and you only have the textbook to go off, then that is your picture of the world. If you only see a terrorist, so to speak, on the news and they show you the same image again and again and again, that's your only example of a terrorist in the broader sense. And so if you can paint these pictures in the first place, then you can understand how people are going to respond to them. And by the clever use of these aspirational guides and class structures and things that basically tell people what is the way to behave and what is to be expected, you can basically control people. And then the other aspects of that is fear, obviously, because it drops you into a state whereby you're thinking on the fly, you're in fight or flight, you're not utilizing the most of your critical analysis. If there's a bull running at you, say, you don't go, right, okay, now let's have a think about this. Like, okay, as far as I remember, bulls don't. You just go, oh, for God's sake, right, okay, and jump out of the way or act on instinct. Right. And so if you can implement all of these things going on at the same time, which is would be the efforts of the Tavistock Institute, according to their manifestos and such, then that's the way that you can control the majority of people the majority of the time, basically.
Well, the perfect example is, and a lot of folks here in the United States, they don't even realize this, that 6 companies own all of the media, virtually all of the media. I think it's like 90%. So they're talking about television, they're talking about magazines, radio, talking about the movies that come out. So all it really takes is for 6 people to get on a conference call and to decide what it is that you and I are going to see and what it is we're not going to see.
I think it was in the early 90s. I could have got the date wrong. But basically, the CIA at one time, and it's still the current practice, it owns more publishing houses or it publishes more magazines, articles, books and publications than I think at the time, which I believe was the early 90s, it was 40 times more than the largest legitimate publishing house in America. This is the point. Advertising works best when you're not paying attention to it. Okay, and so sort of poison works best when it's hidden in your favorite food. So the innocuous things like magazines and everyday sort of a book, a fictional book, for example, will perhaps paint an image in your head of say, a foreign country or a religion or an aspect of the world that you're not immediately familiar with. And that could be your only sort of, or your introduction to that particular sort of topic. So if, for example, you're wanting to, portray something, a particular country as being very, very backward or whatever, you could do this surreptitiously by making sure that, either making sure that the right people get out there, or just telling people to go and write this type of book. Make sure that this gets out there and gets very, very popular at the minute, because we need to demonize X, Y, and Z.
Neil, have you given any thought to why it is so pervasive? I mean, this mind control program is pervasive. It's all over the place.
Mm-hmm.
Why? Is it just power and control, or is there something larger at play?
Well, I mean, that's difficult to say, because, I mean, that you could only speculate.
Right.
But, I mean, the only sort of thing that you could go off is that basically this is sort of the nature of civilization, so to speak. It's not new. There's always been some sort of manifestation of control. I mean, if you go back to sort of Greco-Roman times and such, they had the traveling players, or the so-called traveling players, that would tell you about the rest of the world. And this at the time was carefully orchestrated so that basically no views that would be detrimental to the present society would get out there. So basically the consensus view was the view that was continued, and therefore the status quo stayed relatively stable, because up was up, down was down, left was right, and you're living in these are the best times, you've never had it so good. And obviously mechanisms like this can be used all the time. A very simple one is basically, this area's mine now, by the way, God said. Did he? Yes, yes, he did. So go on, off you pop, go on, build me some sort of giant statue or something like that. There's all these sorts of things that can be used. So it's not new per se. It just molds and shifts and is fluid, relevant to the time that you're in and relative to the technological era and the like, basically. So, yeah, I think it really is a sort of a control through confusion. Class is a big thing. It's not really spoken about ever, really, but there's certainly a demonization of the welfare class, and there's certainly from people who would be considered upper class, like politicians. I mean, this is the great thing that people sometimes don't see, that there is a huge class divide between, say, normal people, the proletariat, so to speak, and people who are politicians. They're often very, very aristocratic people, landed gentry almost. You could make the argument that are making decisions for you, almost to give you the impression that, you're just like these people and they could actually help. And yet you could make the argument that it's just a continuation. It's a maintaining of the equilibrium. It's managing society. It's not changing anything. It's just changing of the guard. Let's just put this colour up and this colour up, and then people believe that we're actually moving forward. So yeah, I mean, this thing is completely multifaceted. There's confusion, there's fear, there's the worry of losing your house, there's financial things, there's the want to better yourself, there's the constant knowledge that basically if you just had this next thing, life would be so much better. If I could just have that car, then all the girls would suddenly fling themselves at me. If I could just, have that new iPhone, then people would treat me with respect, for example. And it's multifaceted. This is as complicated as civilization itself, but there are numerous things that are basically there to make you toe the line. For example, you want to get on in the world of work. Well, there's two things that you've got to get used to. One thing is that basically it's a fear-based commodity. This is economic theory that your job is going to basically make you feel terrified and overworked, because then you're going to work harder, in theory, because you're terrified that you're going to lose your job. And the other thing that basically you need to understand is, if you want to get on in the world, you've got to be prepared to do work for no pay. And that means either internships, extra hours, somebody else's work, you've got to lick spittle, etc., etc., etc. You've got to mold yourself to a perspective in order to get a lick of that next brass ring. Okay, right. This is the thing. So there's a subtle changing, and this can be, and it's not necessarily a bad thing. A lot of people say, well, that's just growing up. That's, you're getting older and blah, 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 blah. That's fine if you wish to do that. But basically know what you're getting into in the first place, basically. And I think it's a subtle change that you realize that you are changing yourself, and you're doing things that that you're justifying for a financial gain and for again, an engineering of consent. Yeah, fine, okay, it's not fair, but I'm going to have to sack John, you see, because basically, A, he's not really towing the line, and B, basically, it makes me look good. And then obviously, I've hit my quota, I can do that. 6 months ago, you might not have done that, but now you're doing that because you're understanding from, say, the company perspective. Now, is that wrong? No, that's not necessarily. That's a glib example. But basically, there's ways that the world can mold you to go along, to get along, basically. I mean, essentially you can be on the fringe and do that, but you're marginalized, and it's made clear that you're marginalized, and it's difficult to have a say. Do you want to say is another question. But these are the mechanisms that work. It's like an animal, basically. You're clinging to it, and if you can be shook off it if you want, but then perhaps you're not in as good a position. Of course, what you don't realize is that this animal that you're clinging to is probably trying to eat you. So you're damned either way, I'm afraid.
Well, you made some very, very good points there, Neil. I mean, one of the things that I wrote down here was managing society, and most people have no idea that they're being managed. The system is set up so they actually believe that they have choice and that they're free, right? But they are actually being managed. And the example you use with the company, how many times, I know personally myself, have I heard something that goes down in a company, in a corporation, they say, well, it's only business.
Yeah, it's the justification of it and the rationalization and the normalization, which is, by definition, engineering or manufacturing consent, which is basically you say, yeah, that's acceptable because of X, Y, and Z. And it's a dangerous sort of road if you don't sort of appreciate what the end goal is. And another manufacturing of consent is basically demonizing of a foreign nation, for example, and through propaganda, which you might see through, suspiciously all at the same time, through television plays and dramas and a book that's come out and a couple of films like All of a Sudden, True Lies and The Siege and Honor Under Fire and Executive Decision, and all these films all just simultaneously all come out. It was highly suspicious that in a very similar time, a lot of films that were criticized for their, shall we say, anti-Muslim tilt, which was basically Honor Under Fire, I think it's called, with Meg Ryan, The Siege with Bruce Willis, Executive Decision, True Lies. All of these films came out with a lot of the major action stars of the time, okay, and basically shifted the paradigm, so to speak, or shifted basically who the enemy was all of a sudden in common culture. All of a sudden, like, you couldn't do a Russian gag anymore, or a Russian villain gag anymore, because all of a sudden the kids that were watching it didn't have that frame of reference. Right. But what's interesting is these kids didn't get that frame of reference from watching the news, did they? They got the frame of reference from watching the television, the films, the entertainment aspects of it.
That's predictive programming.
Yes, you could make that argument that, and it certainly seemed to be like either that or it was like, just incredible odds.
So, Neil, when we look at mind control today from the perspective of a modern concept of mind control, when did it really get traction? When did it really get started?
Well, as I say, I mean, like if you're talking societally, then, when society started, basically, but if we're talking about personal mind control, Manchurian candidates and stuff like that. Right. Okay, then basically, now this is an interesting one as well, because there are certain passages in the Egyptian Book of the Dead that talk about using incantations or mantras, which could be considered hypnosis or that type of thing, the use of potions and powders and drugs, and also the use of torture and sort of to fatigue people in order to, induce this. So there is a suggestion that certain aspects of this are a lot older than might be at first considered. From a documentation, shall we say, it really started in the sort of 1920s with the Tavistock Institute. It started very much with trying to get truth serums and poisons and from espionage in an interrogation scenario, basically. I mean, they kind of sort of fell into it almost. Well, actually, really, it was a bit before that, because Tavistock obviously came out of Wellington House and Crewe House, which were the propaganda departments that were connected mysteriously to people like Toynbee and Lord Northcliffe, who owned the Daily Express and the Times and the Daily Mail, the major newspapers at the time, and which is peculiar because the Daily Mail at the time was considered a fascist paper, so it was giving German propaganda whilst the owner was actually doing English propaganda to try and convince people to go into Europe and start hacking each other to bits, basically. So So we got that aspect of it, and then essentially the Tavistock Institute started in the 20s, 1921, with a chap called Hugh Crichton Miller, and ostensibly what they were trying to do was they were treating soldiers that had post-traumatic stress disorder, or what it was called at the time was shell shock, and these people were either catatonic or very, very severely withdrawn, and they wanted to try and figure out how to cure them, apparently. Now, however, how many were cured is not entirely clear. But what is clear is that basically from this research, serendipitously probably, they managed to find out that basically if you push a man's psyche to a certain extent, you can break a person. You can basically shatter a man's mind. And then from there on, they started to think, well, can we start to rebuild a man's mind? And from then on, it gets a bit shady. There's certain suggestions that Russians were using this in show trials in the 30s and such like that. And Menditsky was one that was apparently went on trial. He was a Hungarian priest and apparently just went on trial. And this was actually later than the show trials. This is separate. But basically, the gist is that people were going on trial and robotically admitting to crimes that they obviously didn't commit and seemingly happily taking sentences. Off the back of that, apparently American GIs were then later submitted to similar experiments in the Korean War when they're captured, and they were admitting to all sorts of things like aerosolized anthrax and chemical warfare, all of these sorts of war crimes which were completely untrue. Now, apparently this is why the CIA had to get involved and start looking into its own sort of elements of mind control. How can we control a person's personality, control their actions, and control their thoughts, and get them to do something that's contrary to their own personal safety? Now, apparently they had to do it because obviously this was happening in Korea, except if you look at the documentation, because then you discover that basically they'd already been starting Project Chatter in 1947 through the Office of Naval Intelligence, and Bluebird started in 1951 prior to the start of the Korean War, so certainly prior to anyone actually getting detained. And mysteriously, Bluebird started on April the 20th, 1951, which was the anniversary of Hitler's birth. But I'm positive that that's just one of those mysterious coincidences.
It's a coincidence. Yeah.
I mean, what later came out as well, actually, was an area that I missed, was that certainly in Dachau and Auschwitz, what would be remarkably similar to later experiments by the CIA were being performed, including sort of amphetamine and barbiturate ups and downs, forced withdrawal from heroin, but also the use of various things such as caffeine and stuff to keep people awake for long periods of time, truth serums. I think there was talk about they certainly used mescaline.
Mescaline, yes. Yeah.
And, the other thing that people inject that you get at the dentist's, there was Thorazine experiments and various other things as well. But basically, a lot of the things that people like Joseph Mengele were actually doing as well, he was trying things with putting people in barbiturate-induced comas for series of times, seemingly were repeated 10 or 15 years later in St Thomas's Hospital in London by William Sargent, and in McGill University in Canada by
Ewan Cameron.
Exactly, and obviously they took it a step further with electroshock and LSD and various things. You could track some of their experimentation back to the very Nazis that Ewan Cameron was actually prosecuting at the Nuremberg trials, because he sat on the board of the jurors, determining whether these people were breaking their Hippocratic oath, which he would later do with aplomb himself, basically. So the start of it is tricky, because obviously everybody's saying that they're doing it as a response for everybody else, basically. And but the other thing is that basically when you start to look at it, certainly in later years, you see a cross-contamination of the use of various doctors and techniques and drugs and certain things that were highly classified, whether this is through sort of double agent espionage or whatnot, or whether behind the scenes there's actually a more covert collaboration is difficult to say. Certainly a lot of the very, very highly classified Russian mind control equipment ended up being owned by SciTech, which was a CIA-run organization that helps people learn how to remote view and stuff like that, basically. So It's difficult to say, but if you want to look at it from sort of a Western perspective, certainly the First World War and the Second World War, they were trying things, mostly interrogation. During the Second World War, they got into hypnoprogramming, which is basically double agents that don't know they're double agents, splitting the mind and putting a different personality into people's heads so that they could be dropped into a scenario whereby they wouldn't be found out, and then leak all the information back through the other personality, transferring a large amounts of information, using people like a camera. You walk into a room, you look at something, you drop into a different personality, they're able to sort of immediately take in all the information that you need to, switch back to a different personality, go home, you don't know that what you've done, and you can't get rid of it, you can't access the information without the code word, etc., etc. So that's when it really started kicking off, and from then on, basically, there was the formation of the OSS into the CIA. Yeah. MI6 was formed, etc., 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 and so came to be, a post-war organization. You've already got the influence of things like Crew House. Tavistock was starting to get involved in the sort of psychological houses, and again, what is normal medically, what is normal mentally, what is a sane thing to do, what is an insane thing to do. You've got the media aspect coming out from there. So it seemed to sort of spread basically just before the First World War and then afterwards. But I'm pretty sure that basically, as I said, the societal aspect of it is as old as society itself.
Now, Neil, some people will equate hypnosis with mind control and mind control with hypnosis. And I try to explain to folks that this is not true, that hypnosis is one tool in their toolbox in which to do the mind control.
Yeah.
Right? So I was wondering if we could talk a little bit about the de-pattern, re-pattern type of work that maybe you and Cameron was doing.
Yeah.
Which that's a perfect example of where the mind control program was very multifaceted, where, pain, electric shock, sensory deprivation, drugs, and hypnosis were used in order to break the mind down.
Well, I mean, you and Cameron, this is one of the things as well. He did it in Canada because basically then you can't be prosecuted under the American laws, because obviously then, again, in McGill University, it was the Allen Memorial Institute, and they were very kindly, they had these old stables and they basically converted them for him and turned them into this top of the range experimentation center. Basically, what was strange was he was the head of the American and the World Psychiatric Board, basically. So he was the most prestigious, or considered one of the most prestigious doctors in his field at the time. What he basically said was that any personality trait was a pattern, a harmful pattern that you'd learned, and this could be from alcoholism to depression to schizophrenia to whatever. It was a harmful pattern that you'd learned, and so what he would do was he would de-pattern you. He'd de-pattern you with basically a combination of LSD, forced coma, and then electroshock, and obviously a little bit wasn't enough. We're talking 65 days straight on LSD in the most extreme circumstances, 65 days straight in a forced barbiturate-induced coma, inducing electroshock 76 times higher than the legal safe dosage. And basically what this would do, it would completely de-pattern the mind. He playfully called it annihilation. He was one of these sort of people that he was obsessed with Pavlov, as far as I know, as well, and control. He felt that basically physical means could solve physiological means, and drugs could solve psychological problems. So it's just the equivalent of basically beating somebody until they feel better, really, if you think about it. He's not well talked about now because obviously everything that he did in this sort of sense is completely ethically irresponsible. And the reason for this was because he was doing work for the CIA. And what they were doing was, as I say, through this combination of ECT, coma, and LSD, they were wiping people's minds, just completely wiping the personality, turning them into a vegetable, really. I mean, the famous case is Linda McDonald, who went in there for just very mild postnatal depression, just wasn't really sort of feeling like getting up and doing stuff. She went in there, and I think within and it was a very short period of time, she couldn't remember who she was. She never remembered who her husband or her children were. She forgot how to play the guitar. She forgot how to learn to use the toilet again, learn how to speak again. She's okay now, or I mean, I don't know if she's still alive, but basically she had to be a new person. And so you can explain to her who her husband is, but she's got no emotional connection with him. Or you can explain to her who her children are, but the same thing, she can't actually remember like any involvement with them at all. I mean, she was one person that basically sued Ewan Cameron. Well, I don't believe she sued Ewan Cameron. I believe she sued the medical board of Canada.
Right, that's right.
And she got a settlement, but it sounded like a lot, because the thing is, basically, it sounded like $1 million or something like that, but then I think it was split between 8 plaintiffs, and then obviously you take court costs or whatever out of it. So it wasn't really very good, but tacitly they were acknowledged and given some cash. But there was another lady called Proctor, I forget her first name, but she got arrested when she was like 18 for some petty theft or whatever. And a lot of the experimentation that was taking place was also in prisons in Ontario and various places in Canada. And she specifically, she was put in a segregation cell with just a single bulb and nothing on the floor, and just a hole in the bottom of the door. She was supposed to basically defecate on the floor and then force it through this hole with her hands, as far as we could tell. And the whole time she was being given intravenous doses of LSD and various other different types of hallucinogen, just to see what was going on, really, to be quite honest. But this was not uncommon during the sort of heyday of MK Ultra, so to speak. The way that they sort of managed to do it was almost like hiding it in plain sight. A lot of the experimentation was taking place by highly prestigious medical people in the most expensive institutions, supported by universities, supported by boards of very, very astute people that apparently, and very sort of highly educated people, the sort of the cream of their field. And therefore, all these experiments were seen as pioneering medical techniques rather than the actual sort of destruction of the brain that they actually were.
Yeah, it's really pure evil, really is. And I think it's very important to cover this, because hypnosis sometimes gets mixed in with that is mind control, and it is not.
Yeah, I mean, hypnosis is an incredibly powerful tool. I'm a hypnotherapist myself. I would recommend it to anybody that's got any problems with anxiety, depression, phobias, even some things. If you go to a curative hypnotherapist, even certain what could be considered mystery physical ailments, irritable bowel syndrome, it can help with getting you on the mindset to weight loss. It's a fabulous, fabulous tool. I'm quite good at it, right? Okay. The person that taught me is a genius at it. We've talked about this, he couldn't do the stuff that is talked about in the declassified documents even. There's even an argument as to whether you could make somebody, take the top off, or like, okay, stay in trance, I'm going to feel you up and you're not going to remember it. I know I couldn't do that. I don't know if the people that taught me could do that. They've said they did experiments to see if it could with, people that willing subjects, and they couldn't do it, which leads me to believe that in order to induce the effects that are documented, that have come about through hypnotism, a certain amount of something else must be put in. Okay, be that trauma, context, whatever, that is required. Now, this is where it gets in, because basically, so George Esterbrook said that the hypnotist's power is unlimited, or rather, only as limited as his scruples are. I would believe that. I think it would take a lot of time and coercion and rapport building, and then basically consciously going against that in order to manipulate a person into doing it. There's several ways that you could use hypnosis in mind control. You could program somebody in a contextual way. You could get them to think that the person over there, you're at war, or that person over there is going to kill your wife. Kill them, otherwise that's going to happen. You could perhaps get them to do it in a way whereby they very heavily believe that they're doing another action, like at a shooting range, and don't realize that they're actually firing at a person. And then the final way is just to be a complete and total swine by making this person so malleable and trusting in you that they'll do anything on the understanding that you would never let anything bad happen to them. If you can impress into somebody to the degree that basically, look, you might think you're stabbing your wife to death, but you know that I would never let you do that. Mm-hmm. So do it. Do you know what I mean? It's that sort of strange double bluff. So these would be the 3 methods that you could use hypnosis in order to affect mind control. None of those would be possible with a normal hypnotherapist. None of those would be possible without really, really taking your time and having a particularly malleable person. Yes. And also, I would suggest you'd probably have to introduce a degree of trauma into that. to get the required results, because obviously these things have happened. I could see how they would happen, but I don't see with the common or garden, so to speak, hypnotherapy that you would learn. I don't think you could do that.
I agree, Neil. I'm a hypnotherapist also. So
Ah,
I agree with everything that you just said. And it really, those examples that you use, the degree of suggestibility of the client is paramount.
exactly, yeah.
Absolutely paramount.
And that could be induced by fatiguing them, putting them in a cult-like scenario. Do you know what I mean? Weakening them by no food, no sleep, etc., etc. You could induce this suggestibility, but this is that I think that's spot on, man. Like, you would need to do something or have a very, very, very specific subject in order to immediately induce any of those sort of effects, basically. So it leads me to believe that basically people like Sirhan and Mark Chapman and other people like that who would appear have been hypnotically induced in some way, there must have been an incredible amount of other stuff going on as well, basically. And I think the hypnosis was just used as the sort of the methodology. It's kind of like, basically, this was the spanner that we finally used to attach this element to the front of your car. But we did all these other things to make this enormous thing to put on it. Do you know what I mean? So the hypnosis in that respect is a tool that can be used, but only, as you say, if the context, the subject, and so many other things are right. And also, basically, you'd have to be a very specific type of person to do that, because the way you'd have to be either a brilliant actor or a complete psychopath, because you'd have to be putting all these positive feelings and building the person up and gaining rapport, and all the time knowing in the back of your mind, but giving no hint in your tone or the way that you're speaking or the suggestions or the language that you use. You'd have to script it out, because otherwise, unless you're a complete psychopath, you'd drop in the occasional word that would basically not, you know what I mean, that would jar with the thing. So yeah, it's a tricky one. I have no doubt that it has been used, but I don't believe that it's as simple as right, pick up a book, go on a course, do this, blah blah blah,
Right.
and then get on with it. You'd need. I mean, again, the people that were actually doing this, like George Estabrooks, were the very, very cream of their field. Again, the people that probably have tried every single facet, and then once you've got an unlimited thing, or oppressing. I mean, George Estabrooks justified what he was doing because he said it's wartime. That's the thing. You can justify anything. He also said that basically he could make any man, without his knowledge, commit treason, commit acts of murder or suicide, and he meant it. He says this is not science fiction. This is fact. I've done it. It was in a New Science magazine article in 1947. He said I've induced split personalities. I've made Manchurian candidates, so to speak. This is not science fiction. It's a fact. I've seen it. I've done it, and I believe him. Right, but I don't believe he just basically went, follow my finger, lovely, okay, you're going deeper, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, right, you're a killer. It wouldn't work.
No, that doesn't work. Yeah.
Like, I mean, just look at how many sessions that you need to do just to basically get somebody something very simple like nail biting, or something very innocuous, and something you know that is, or even how difficult it can be to get some certain subjects to stop smoking. Some people can do it in an hour. Some people you need to do it again and again and again, depending on how they've started it and such like that. I don't think you could go up to somebody randomly in the street and just boom, put them in. Even if you did like an instant induction technique, shaking their arm and smacking the forehead or anything like this, right? Okay, you could not then program to kill, so to speak. You'd need to do a lot of stuff, post-hypnotic stuff as well. That's a misnomer. I've got a friend as well that basically he won't let me do any hypnosis on him because he thinks he's basically like a combination of Jedi mind tricks and the Vulcan nerve pinch. And I keep trying to tell him that basically it's not. Any hypnotherapist that's worth the soul tell you, you don't hypnotize people. You allow them to hypnotize themselves and give them the correct scenario.
That's exactly right. I have people tell me that they don't want to do it because they don't want to divulge any dark, deep secrets.
Yeah, that's always the thing.
That kind of stuff. It's, they just don't understand.
Well, it's the Hollywood method thing, isn't it? Because basically they've got to give it dramatic license. So anytime you're seeing somebody with hypnosis, they're either reliving something horrific or they're uncovering a memory that they didn't know about before. There's someone's coming into the room, and that never happens. Basically, certainly not in the therapeutic sessions, that methodology that I would use, because 9 times out of 10 it's yes or no answers anyway. Because obviously you speak to the subconscious. So, but this is the that's perception management, isn't it? This is the misnomer that the general public has, because 9 out of 10 people probably won't know a hypnotherapist, or even if they do, they're not going to say, all right, show me how it works, show me to me, and let me watch you do it to somebody else. All they're going to know is the guy with the big watch in the film, basically, or somebody on YouTube doing a regression or does something like that, and which sometimes you have to be very wary of. So I've seen a lot of stuff that purports to be hypnosis on YouTube, and it's like, no,
you don't believe it?
Yeah. No, it's like, I mean, I'd like to know how you induced them for a start. That's one. And they like, if you're ever watching a hypnotic induction and somebody goes, "Sorry, what?" then you're probably not. It's not the deepest of trance states, shall we say? So.
Let me ask you, Neil, Tavistock, and this is a little bit of a shift here in questioning, but Tavistock and the 1960s music scene.
Yes.
If we pick, let's just say, the Beatles as an example, you'll read stuff out there that says the Beatles are a product of Tavistock, and I've read stuff that said that it goes as far as saying that they were mind-controlled, that Tavistock created the package called the Beatles, basically as a program to engineer society.
Well, I've even heard that Theodor Adorno of the Frankfurt School and a dialectic of Enlightenment fame wrote all their music, apparently, which I don't believe that. I could see how the Beatles might have been utilized, because obviously it's the creation of the teenager. It's suspiciously at a similar time to, or off the back of, the guy with the kiss curl, can't remember the guy, in America, basically, and then Elvis, and, the prevalence of this new culture, which you could cynically argue was, it depends how cynical you want to get. It's a way of controlling kids and telling them how to spend their life, or if you want to go slightly less cynical, but it's still horrible, it's a way of telling teenagers how to spend their money. Now, either of those is horrible, but basically. Now, were the Beatles set up to be this element? I don't know. I don't think so. I think that they may have been utilized. I don't think that anyone wrote their music, but it would be naive to suggest that they didn't have the best studios, the best management paying girls to fame, the best publicity machine.
Well, George Martin as their producer to start, right?
Exactly.
Right.
And Brian Epstein,
right.
Both of them geniuses in their field, okay. but they certainly could hold a tune together anyway. Now, the argument would they be as big as they were if they weren't behind this, had this machine, and somebody had decided that this was a good thing to do. Now, was this pure money-making device, or was this, again, to sort of move society in a particular way? And even if it was, does that mean that the Beatles were involved? I mean, obviously, there's a lot of connections with the Laurel Canyon scene, all the hippie movement and stuff like that, to their parents being in naval intelligence, and Jim Morrison's dad being the admiral on deck during the Gulf of Tonkin incident, Frank Zappa's dad working at Edgware Arsenal, Joan Baez's dad working with the Human Ecology Fund. The list goes on and on and on and on and on. The Grateful Dead being CIA agents, that's a big giveaway. And Timothy Leary being a CIA agent. So obviously, something was going on. Does it necessarily mean that the artists themselves were evil? No. Doesn't. No. Does it mean that they weren't talented? No, it doesn't. Right. I think it would be naive to suggest that basically the Beatles weren't used in some sense. I mean, one of the key things was that basically, the riling up of Middle America, Southern America with the "we're bigger than Jesus" statement and stuff like that. Was it a social experiment? Was it just something that sold newspapers? Difficult to say. I don't believe that the Beatles were created and such. I do believe that the Beatles were given help to be the big monster entity that they were, and I think that once they were the monster entity that they were, certain things were suggested to them, like when they went to see the Maharishi and such like that. There was a direct correlation with Mike Love of the Beach Boys, and various other people went as well. That was directly correlating to the human potential movement, which came off the back of M.K. Often, this transcendental meditation and such like that. The counterculture, a lot of the elements that were involved with that were CIA ran. Again, doesn't necessarily negate the disciplines themselves, but it's one of these things. If you're going to win a race, own all the horses.
Right.
And so basically, when they were sort of promoting acid and stuff like that, I mean, they got their acid from Michael Hollingshead, who was a MI6 agent, for crying out loud. So obviously something weird's going on. Do I think that they were all completely mind controlled? No, I don't. However, there's lots of things that sort of raise certain flags. There's a prevalent producer in England called Jonathan King. He's currently in prison for produced Pink Floyd, I believe, as well. He's in prison for child sex charges at the minute. He claims to have had a sexual affair with a very young John Lennon. Bit of a red flag, something going on there. Obviously, the weirdness with the suspected death of Paul McCartney and stuff like that. Again, I don't take notice of that. However, we have a program in England called Blue Peter. The dog died on Blue Peter, and rather than hurt children's feelings, they replaced it with another dog. Now, I'll tell you what, the Beatles make a lot more money than Blue Peter, so I can understand why they might. I'm not saying they did by any stretch of the imagination, but it's like it wouldn't be the first time, it wouldn't be the only time that somebody had been replaced, shall we just say. So yeah, there's a lot of weird things that go on with the Beatles and stuff like that. You know, the Manson element, obviously this is the thing that a lot of people say that Charles Manson was obsessed with the Beatles and that Mark Chapman was obsessed with the Beatles. Obviously, that's the other thing, you know, the Mark Chapman element. He was obviously a mind-controlled assassin.
Yes.
Although he didn't kill John Lennon, it's more than likely a bloke called Jose Padermo, who was a CIA agent that just happened to be working as the doorman on that one and only night. And he was the key and only witness and the person that apparently wrestled the gun off Mark Chapman. So there you go. The Manson thing, I don't think that's real either. I think that was used to demonize the Beatles. This concept that basically he'd got these messages from the Beatles music and it foretold of a black-white race war in which the white man would be killed and blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah-de-blah, and Revelation number 9. And there's loads. I could go on all day about it, but it's boring. It's nonsense because it wasn't Charles Manson that came up with that. It was a chap called Paul Watkins that came up with that whilst he was doing acid with Susan Atkins. So it wasn't really Charles Manson's thing at all. He wasn't a Beatles fan. He was a Bing Crosby fan. If you listen to all of his music, he kind of liked the Beatles, but he basically, this is kid stuff, you know. I'm 33 years old at the minute, you know, this is for you 16, 17-year-olds. I like this sort of stuff. His music doesn't sound like that. Tell you who he was close to. He was close to Neil Young, and he was close to, well, Elvis Presley to an extent, Mamas and the Papas, and famously the Beach Boys. Him and Dennis Wilson were very close, if you know what I mean. Basically, he ended up staying at Dennis Wilson's house. He didn't just turn up after Dennis picked up these two girls, which is the story. He was having a poker game with Dennis Wilson at Elvis Presley's house when Elvis Presley wasn't there. This was a mafia-run game, by the way, and he won a lot of money off Dennis. And Dennis says, well, I can either pay you the cash, or do you want to come and stay at my place for a little bit? So that's what happened. Dennis Wilson was also basically taken along to Brian's house, recording loads of tracks and stuff like that. And they got a record deal, and Bobby Beausoleil actually, with Brother Records. And this all went south when Bobby Beausoleil killed Gary Hinman, because then they didn't want to be associated with it. So they cancelled both of their contracts. That's apparently the thing that Doris Day's son let them down on, because he was supposed to fulfill certain bargains. But basically, the point is, you've got all these real, actual ties to superstars and such like that. What's a brilliant way to disguise that? Well, you could get Nick Grillo, who was the Beach Boys manager, who was also mafia connected. Basically, you could get him to start talking about the Beatles and then pay people like Paul Watkins and stuff like that to start talking about the Beatles, to not only move it away from your clients, but also to demonize this new group. If you wanted to get very cynical about it, you could then basically say, well, weren't the Beatles talking about love, all you need is love? And weren't the hippies talking about love, all you need is love? And didn't that knacker it up for the Beatles because their association with the Manson family? Didn't that knacker it up for the hippies because of their association with the Manson family? And how did those hippies get associated with the Manson family? Oh yeah, it was Bernadine Doyen, wasn't it? Of the Weathermen, who was a CIA agent. She said, it's the year of the fork, dig it. Those pigs went in there, killed those rich kids, and even left a fork in the belly in their stomach. You know, nobody thought anything other than this is just a grubby little drug murder, right up until the point then all these prominent counterculture people are coming out and saying, hey kids, this is the sort of thing. I mean, what was it, Jerry Rubin that said kill your parents or whatever? Like, I mean, I know he didn't actually say that, but you know what I mean? This is the implication. It's the making this counterculture set violent. It's setting it in the perception of the general public, like with the Beatles and such like that, like with the teenager. You know, once you've got a teenager, you can then start to manipulate them and turn them against, demonize them, talk about, ooh, teenage pregnancy or whatever, which is not a new thing. None of these problems are new, but you can resell it because basically it's a new marketing stratagem, basically.
Just going back for a moment, Neil, to the Beatles and Tavistock, it was apparent, at least to me, that Lennon had figured it out early on, that there was manipulation going on. And, I mean, you can just tell by some of the comments that John would make, especially later in his career, especially in his solo career. And he talked a lot about the controllers and the puppet masters, and it was just good to get your perspective on it because there is so much crazy stuff out there.
John, just before he died, I mean, the last interview that he did, one of the last interviews he did was with Playboy.
Playboy, yeah.
And it was the one where he's talking about LSD, and he basically says the CIA gave us LSD. It didn't do what they expected it to do, and I think that's absolutely right, because I believe the Tavistock influence as well is apparently basically through Aldous Huxley and Argun Wasson and various other people, the popularization of psychedelics, and then Timothy Leary through like Cord Meyer and Frank Barron and all these other CIA agents who are basically all culminating with banking scions like William Hitchcock Mellon, and then people that have been in and out of institutes like St. Elizabeth's Hospital, which are known for mind control, like Owsley Huxley and Owsley Stanley and Alfred Hubbard, all turn up and just so happen to come together and coalesce for this fabulous thing that we call the LSD explosion in the counterculture, led by people like merry pranksters and people like that who just so happen to be involved in MK Ultra experiments when they were younger and stuff like that. And the Grateful Dead, who were managed by Owsley Stanley for a period of time and such like that. And then the connection through all these things. But again, it's how you look at it. The perception of the general public was this was just an organic explosion of stuff, and it totally wasn't. It really, really wasn't. Basically, it's I think that's what Lennon saw. I think he rejected it because to an extent. And I think a few other people have done that, and that suspiciously they always seem to end up young deaths.
Yeah,
that must be just.
Well, there's questions around Jimi Hendrix's death also.
Jimi Hendrix was murdered by his manager, whose name was, what was his name?
Yeah.
But he was an MI6 agent as well, and he admitted it to several people.
His manager admitted?
Yeah, he admitted it to at least two people, basically, that they went around to Monica Danica's flat, they held his mouth open, they shoved a handful of pills down his stomach, and they poured 2 bottles of wine down his neck. And basically this was borne out by Thomas Degucci, who was the person that performed the autopsy, and he said his lungs were full of red wine, and his hair was saturated in red wine. There was none in his stomach, and there was none in his bloodstream, which was bizarre, because that's not how you drink wine.
Right.
So... I can't remember his what's his name? Sorry, it's going to really bug me.
How about Jim Morrison?
Well, I mean, Jim Morrison is another strange one, isn't he? I mean, basically, he claimed that, I can't remember, what's his name? Michael Jeffrey. Thank you. Michael Jeffrey was Jimi Hendrix's manager. Jim Morrison, basically, he claimed, he's one of these weird people, basically, he claimed that his parents were dead in a lot of interviews, and both of them actually outlived him. His parents, he grew up on certain military bases, and his father was admiral on deck during the Gulf of Tonkin incident, and he basically exploded and changed, never had any musical talent, and managed to write these songs basically in his head and then be able to convey them to other musicians so that they could play them and such like that, which is incredibly difficult to do. He claimed to be possessed by the spirit of an American shaman, I believe, Native American shaman, and he quit the Doors because the spirit had left him and left him talentless, according to what he said, basically. So who knows? Dave McGowan's obviously done the best stuff on the whole Laurel Canyon scene. He's got a book out at the minute called Weird Scenes in the Canyon.
In fact, I just ordered that book.
Oh, it's fantastic.
Is it fantastic?
Yeah, it's really good. It's based on his the previous stuff that he was done online, and he's added a few bits and bobs on top of it and stuff like that. So yeah, it's ever so good. Really, really good.
Neil, when did you get started with your research? Because your level of knowledge is phenomenal.
I was doing it as a hobby. It's a bit strange, basically. I was trying to blackmail a friend into joining a band with me, right? And there's this program in England called Rich Planet TV, and I was a big fan of the programs, like UFOs, conspiracies, all that sort of jazz. And they had a section where you could send music in, and so I'd recorded this like ska track and put Aldous Huxley's speech about, the one at the Tavistock Institute in California, where basically he says there's no way a scientific dictatorship should ever fail, and sent it to the guy that did the program. He says, "Oh, this is good," and he put it on. And he just emailed me saying, like, "Oh, what's this about?" And so I just said, "Oh, it's this chap Aldous Huxley. He says blah 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 blah." And he was emailing me back and forth, and he says, "Oh, right, do you want to come on and do a program?" So I thought, yeah, sod it, why not? Let's give it a go. So I went on, and we had enough to spread it out for 2 programs, and then he got a lot of email response, so he asked me to come back, and then after that, at the back of that, I got some radios and shows and stuff like that. And so he says, "Oh, you need to write a book." And so at that point, I just went, "Oh, sod it. Okay, fine, fair enough. Let's give it a crack." I had a load of sort of notes I'd just been collecting just together anyway, and I just had to sort of mash them all together. And it took about a year in total, basically, and I had to split it into 2 volumes in the end.
I have both copies, yeah.
Oh,
I
wonderful.
bought them.
Oh, wonderful. Oh, that's marvelous. Hopefully you like them. And yeah, that's basically how I got into it. So it was quite serendipitous, actually. I didn't wake up and go. I was a fan of it. Do you know what I mean? Like I liked watching Michael Sarri, Jordan Maxwell, David Icke, all these people, and like even though I don't necessarily agree with everything that they say, it's an interesting perspective.
Yes.
And then obviously a lot of the stuff like 9/11 being an inside job, etc., etc., etc. I was always interested in weird stuff like Satanism and serial killers and like fun stuff, so to speak, like the Loch Ness Monster and Bigfoot, say, whatever. Okay, not to denigrate that, but the sort of first thing that you sort of exposed to of, oh, this is strange, this is. Then the psychology aspect of it that I was doing at school and the advertising and media and stuff like that. I'm quite good with words, so I was always like, I should go into advertising, because I assumed that advertising was exactly like it is on television, where you're dead creative and you basically you walk in and go, oh, here you go, I've come up with this. Oh, you're a genius. Oh, fabulous. And you know what? It's not like that.
No.
It's not like that at all. It's horrible, soul-crushing work. So that never materialized. But just all these sort of aspects, and it just piqued my interest, basically, and it just sort of all came together, and that's it, basically. But so I always describe myself as like a kind of like a DJ, really, because like I've interviewed some people, I've had some contact with people that have been involved in the so-called satanic panic and stuff like that, but mostly I just sort of went out there and sort of started connecting dots and stuff like that, basically. And again, you just find that actually really disparate things have got connections, like Frank Sinatra and Charles Manson. If you want to sort of put it together enough and stuff like that, you can get there, basically. So that's really how I got into it. And yeah, it was just something I was interested in, basically. So.
Well, you're fascinating to speak to.
Oh, thank you. That's very sweet.
Well, unfortunately, Neil, we've reached the end of the hour, and you have been very, very generous with your time. And I would love to have you come back on the show and pick up where we left off and do a part 2, a part 3. In fact, you can come back as many times as you like, because I just find this topic, and I'm sure the audience does, just so amazing.
Oh, I'd love to. Yeah, absolutely. Whenever you're free, mate.
Well, then we're going to have you back, Neil. Consider it done, because this area of mind control is fascinating, and your level of knowledge and expertise is superb. So with that, I would like to thank you again for coming on the show and joining us, and I will definitely be in touch, and have a great, great evening. Talk to you soon. And that concludes my interview with Neil Sanders, and I hope you enjoyed the discussion as much as I did. Neil's website and his book can be found at www.neilsandersmindcontrol.com. And as always, I'd like to thank everyone for listening and for visiting the blog, sageofquay.com. Also, you can take a listen to my album, Leaving Dystopia, by heading to laboroflovemusic.com. And remember, live in truth and always serve creation. It's really that simple. See everyone next week. Be safe, enjoy, and God bless.